we still very, very, very much live in a culture that will demonize and belittle and try and demean people who are enjoying their bodies and their own autonomy and their own ability to do things that they want to do that make them feel good. And my general philosophy is always like, if you are not bringing harm to other people and you are enjoying yourself, the world is literally on fire. Enjoy yours. Like, do the thing that brings you some joy in a world that is actively trying to remove that joy from your life.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Sex Positivity Unfiltered, where we talk about sex and we are not polite about it. And today we are having a frank conversation about queer sex with special guest Eric. And I have known Eric, I've known you for, 14 years now,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
long time. And so I want to just give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell all of us who you are. And you're also a podcaster. So please tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Eric Crumrine. I use he, they pronouns. And my podcast that I do outside of, I guess, talking about sex with folks is, it's called The QueerXP, and it is a tabletop gaming, queer podcast. We do actual plays of queer indie tabletop games. I think by the time this episode releases, we'll have just started season 2.
Oh,
So
awesome.
we'll be in the middle of our spooky season, which is going to be super fun, and playing lots of very spooky tabletop games.
Okay. Oh, well, that's so amazing. I really had no idea that you had a podcast at all, and now I'm learning that about you, and we'll have to tune in. We'll have to tune in and check that out.
I gotta say, I love the hat. Like, my wife would
Oh,
get in love right now. It's great.
Yeah. So, I guess we'll just jump right into it.
Sure.
And, first of all, we're so glad you're here because I just feel like sex in general, but especially gay sex and queerness and all the above is things that people shy away from talking about. And so I don't want to shy away from it. I want to get right into it and hear, firsthand feedback from you. And so my first question for you is, when did you know you were gay, and what was your experience coming to terms with that reality with yourself, but also with friends and family?
Yeah, what was your queer awakening?
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, Josh Hartnett played a large.
Hey, I feel you. Yeah.
No, so I mean, I came out in high school. So I want to say I was like 16 or 17 and coming out, I feel like whenever someone says like, when did you come out? What does that look like? The answer, like, the real answer is like, well, I started at this point and I continue to come out every day, and people that I meet, and you're kind of always gauging that, especially in 2023. Like, sadly, like, our culture in the world is very much like, I don't know how someone's going to respond to different things now, especially depending on where in the country I go. Like, I'm in Boston, so I'm a little bit more fortunate in that regard. But still a game that we play these days. And so I started coming out in high school. Came out to myself first, which was, what I think, growing up in rural Ohio, that's a very challenging space to navigate. And without doing, like, because I could probably spend an entire podcast just talking about like just the coming out story. But came out to myself first, told some friends, like a small group of friends at first, that to kind of gauge like, how is this going to go? And honestly, that took work. Like, it took effort, because nobody at that point really knew anybody who was queer in any way. And so even just having one person was now like a new experience for everybody. Friends eventually got there. Family was generally okay. It was one of those tricky things, was like, I was more amped up about how bad it was going to go than it ended up going. Like, I was fortunate in that regard. And then from there, it was, by the time I got to senior prom, like, I took a guy to prom with me. And so which in rural Ohio, all the implications that you can,
like a bold move.
yeah. I was really good friends with the star quarterback from the football team, and somehow that shielded me from a lot of things, because he was like that one person who was like good at everything. So he was like good at football, he was in choir, he was in the musicals, he like did everything, and so everyone kind of liked him. And I found out after prom that, like, when people were upset that I was there with somebody, but like, he basically said, if you like to get to him, you have to go through me, and everyone backed off.
Wow.
Oh, that's
So
amazing.
yeah. So I mean, that was I had a fortunate overall experience. I don't think it was easy to go through. I don't think it's ever easy to go through. And the one thing I talk about with folks is like, even if things go well, you still have to reconcile in your brain, like, what if it doesn't? And like, you internally live through the idea of like, if my family disowns me, this is how I'll respond. Cause like, you have to be ready for that.
Yeah.
And so even when it goes well, I think it still has its mark, like it still leaves its lasting impressions on you because you have to mentally go through some of those spaces.
Yeah, I can't even imagine because you're right. It's like this negative anticipation just in case, like to kind of protect myself if it doesn't go well. Denise, what I don't know if you and I have ever talked about like your coming out story. Like, what was your
Actually, no, I want to
experience?
commend you, man, for coming out in high school because I had a relationship. I was in a closeted relationship all through my junior, senior year. I did not come out. I would not dare because I saw how they treated a lesbian that we had. I was a junior when I was a sophomore when she was a senior. And I witnessed them throwing water bottles at her. Like the amount of bullying. Oh yeah. The amount of bullying that I saw, I was like, there's no way in hell that I'm coming out here ever. So I waited until I graduated high school, and my partner at the time, she was 1 year younger, so she was still a senior. So we went to her prom together, which was a big accomplishment for me because I wasn't used to being out and proud and everything like that. So yeah, and it's still just like you said before, it is still the same. I'm wearing rainbow today because today is actually Dallas Pride. So,
Nice.
Happy Pride. So anytime there's a Pride parade, I tried to put on my rainbow and do, just kind of represent out in public, even if I'm not going. And there is still walking into Chipotle today, I still felt like that anxiety you get whenever like you're sporting. Okay, here I'm flashing my rainbow. I know a lot of people don't like to see me be proud. I don't know how better to say that, but yeah, they don't like me to flash it too much, right?
Well, and we're like, you're in Boston, we're in Texas, and like Dallas is pretty, I guess like Dallas County is pretty progressive as far as like being in Texas goes. But at the same time, it's not. Like I can be in Dallas and still feel homophobia sometimes, or you know what I mean? Like I feel like our state is very conservative to the extreme. And so no matter how progressive we might be, I still like as a straight person, I can still feel that. So I can't imagine,
Yeah. And I think like, I mean, but like Boston is not shielded from any of that, right? Like I have friends who do drag here in Boston that like are doing children's story hours or just hosting events that are being protested. Like we've had literal Nazis showing up to people's events here. Like I would be remiss if I didn't be like, just because I live in a liberal city and because I'm somewhere that seems more progressive, like shit still happens and like people, like it's not great. Like someone who does episodes of my podcast with me was doing a children's story hour, and like she literally posted footage of like swastika Nazi where like marching outside of her event. And she was able to navigate it, and she was able to like still have the event, and the kids were okay and all of that. But like, I mean, it's a lived reality, I think, regardless of where you are in this country right now.
What's crazy to me about that is like even I feel like my straight friends, if they had a kid that was just in that environment, I would feel more, I would want to protect them more from the Nazi memorabilia than I would want from the drag queen, which is
100%. Yeah, absolutely. It blows
Right.
my mind that people don't see it that way, but people really don't see it that way.
And like, and people are really quick to be like, oh, a children's story hour, let's like roll up with 100 Nazis. But like I sing with the Boston Gay Men's Chorus, and we did our entire June concerts, and like we done our shows, and like never a peep. And it's like, oh, well, when there's 250 of us on a stage with like 1,000-person venue, it gets quiet. But like you'll go when there's 20 families and children. Like, and then you think
in the name of protecting children is
right,
like
in the name of protecting children, which.
Yeah, well, I mean, good point. I guess you're right. No matter where you are, you're really not shielded from it. So it's just really, I don't know, scary to me. Did it take you? I'm curious, like as far as just when you knew you were gay and accepting that for yourself, was it difficult to let that be okay for yourself? Or did it take you a long time, or was it relatively easy? I'm just curious.
Oh, it was, I mean, it was a nightmare. Like it was it was
Mhm.
like there's no reason. Like I grew up in the church and had a generally kind of conservative energy around everything that we were. And I'm like, yeah, it was 100% one of those things where it's like you were given that space of the thing that you might be like that might be twirling around in your brain of like, I don't think I'm like everybody else, and I think I might be this other thing. The messaging was always like, that's bad and like that's wrong and you're sinning and like you need to ask for forgiveness. Like I remember going to like the Christian retreat whatever's, or the Bible, like there was like a Christian rock festival that we went to every summer because that's what you do in rural Ohio. But like I remember going to those and like maybe not externally being emotional in front of everybody, but like internally, like being very emotional about like, oh God, like everything that these people are saying is about me and the struggle that I'm going through right now. And I'm going in the wrong direction. And I need to figure out how to course correct that. And it took probably a couple of years before I was finally able to like realize you can't course correct your identity and like you can't course correct who you are.
Yeah.
Um,
Did you
and
try to
so
play straight at all?
Oh yeah, in high school I dated a girl for 2 years. And it would like, and at that point, like I think it was like, I mean, she like it was mostly I mean, I was like in high school and I'm like, it's high school. Like, what did we really know? Like what did I, as a sophomore in high school, what did I really know about anything?
Yeah.
And so I don't think it was intentionally me being like, I must date this woman to prove to the world that I'm straight, but it was this is what feels like the thing that we're all supposed to be doing. And I really enjoy this person as a human being. And that like friend love that you have for people that is not romantic, it is not sexual, it is not any of those other things. And feeling like, oh, I feel this way for somebody. This must be what signifies that someone should be your girlfriend. And
Mm.
so like I that's why we dated for 2 years, and I felt awful. Like when I came out, like she was one of the first people I told because we had broken up, and I was like, so this isn't like, I think this is why this wasn't working because I don't actually like women. And I remember her initial response being like, I don't want it to come back that like I turned you gay somehow. And I was like, no, like that's not,
Mhm.
because it was hard, because again, I was the only one in my high school. And so there wasn't anything to gauge of like what that experience was like for people.
Yeah. As you're telling that story, I think back to my first boyfriend, and he's gay, and I'm sure knew at the time, but I grew up in a very small Texas town. And if I look back, no one in my school was gay, which I know that's not true, but like living in it, it was like, no one's gay. And then it was like not a thing. And so this first boyfriend that I have, like he's gay, and I didn't know that. I mean, we had broken up, and then I found out later that he's gay. Um, but luckily at the time I was at a place where I could, I don't know, have a lot of empathy for him, because I would imagine, just like you just said, this is what we should be doing. This is what a relationship should look like. I'm sure that's what he was thinking as well, given the environment we grew up in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, a little bit back to the awakening. I just wanted to get a couple details, or I'm just curious, to be honest.
Yeah.
So for me, just a little bit of my experience, my queer awakening kind of started when I was a little bit younger, where I would see Destiny's Child videos and I would feel some type of way, and then I discovered the L word, and then that was like a huge thing where I'm like, okay, these feelings are here. And then I obviously I kissed a girl for the first time. That's when the light bulb just kind of went, and I was like, okay, this is, I remember when our lips touched, literally the first thought that went into my head was, now I'm a lesbian. Like just very much it clicked.
Yeah.
So but it took a really long time for me to be able to, because I've known I was gay since I was 5, but it took me literally a decade, if not more, to just be okay with that. And same thing. So did you have any I don't know, scenes, or you said Josh Hartnett was one of them, but I guess what was that moment? I want to know what your actual moment was, like, okay, this is where I'm going for it. Like, where were you? How old were you? Type thing.
I can't remember because I feel like it was kind of like it was like, for me it wasn't, I don't think, like a specific moment where I was like, this is definitely like all locking into place for me, but it was more so like we were on the cusp of the internet, so like being able to like fine. I remember like at one point, like I had been like popping around on like porn sites, and then like my dad came in later and was like, that was where I learned about internet history, like internet browser history. 'Cause I didn't know that was a thing.
Understood.
Didn't know you had to erase it or
Didn't know that there was a thing that I needed to like worry about. And he's like, why were you clicking around on Hotmail and not spelled like the letters?
Love it.
And I was like, oh, like I misclicked and I just kind of ended up in this. And he's like, Eric, he's like, you were on these pages for a while. And like I was so deep in the denial of like being able to talk about it openly. And like I think he was marginally either trying to give me the space or also in denial a bit himself, that we just like, I was like, no, like it was all a mistake. I swear. I didn't actually mean to look at like dicks everywhere. Like that's not what I meant to do. But I remember the things that I remember were that I used to have friends that would come over and hang out. And this was back in time of what probably, I mean, even then it was pretty awful, but like misogynistic and masculine, like toxic masculinity show called The Man Show. If anyone remembers
I
that
remember
little
the
gem.
Man Show. I remember my dad
Um,
watching the Man Show.
yeah. And like, and it being that space where it was, okay, like everyone else seems to be enjoying girls jumping on trampolines. Like everyone seems to have that energy of like, this is what people are enjoying. And I remember watching and being like, I don't understand. Like, I don't get it. Like, this does nothing for me. I in no way like am, and not that I like knew my friends were turned on in like a sexual way, but it was just like I was like, whatever they're experiencing, I'm not. But then I would catch myself when like it would be men doing something, you know, either you're flipping through like the late night HBO Cinemax, you know, softcore, basically porn things, and you're like, oh, like this dude's fucking this woman, and like I'm not paying attention to the woman in that moment, like I'm paying attention to the man and like his dick and all of those things. We're like, okay, maybe there's some things I need to reconcile here in my brain.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm also curious, like I guess this, timeline of like being on these sites and being in denial about it, and then coming to terms with your sexuality. You can explain this in as much or as little detail as you want, but what was your experience, your first sexual experience with the same sex, and was it a positive or negative one?
Yeah, I remember, and this is always hard to chart out at this point because I'm 38 now, and so trying to remember and map out the chunk of time of like 16 to 18.
Yeah.
But what I will say, I think I do what I remember for what I'll focus on, I think, is like the first time I bottomed for a guy. Like we'll go like the first time like we actually had like penetrative sex. And I was 17 or 18. So it was probably one of those things like looking back, it was probably dicey and maybe age of consent is questionable in this moment. I don't know what Ohio's laws were at that moment because sometimes they were different for same-sex interactions versus heterosexual interactions and what those ages were. But he was in his like mid-20s. And we had met because this was again rural Ohio, and the only place to meet people were Yahoo chat rooms for those of us that remember.
Yes.
Yeah, some of those fun spaces, and we had chatted. He lived in a neighboring town, and it was like in an area where like I knew people that lived in like that town, and actually I knew somewhat like a couple people who like lived on the road that he was on. And I went over there for the first time and like, was texting a friend being like, hey, just want to like let someone know where I am because who knows how this is going to go, but like this is how we have to navigate this because there wasn't other options for having sex. Even when you're the only one that's out in your high school, you don't have a lot of luxury of choice. And it wasn't like I was just like trolling at the bottom of the barrel being like, oh, like you're 97 years old and don't have any teeth, like yes, let's go. But it was very much like this was a person who was showing some interest and was attractive. And so I remember going over and kind of going through the whole process. Like, he was like, are you sure you want to do this? And I was like, yes, like I like literally why I'm here.
Like I'm ready.
I'm ready. I'm looking back, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I was like looking back, I'm like, was I actually like ready? Because I don't know if I was like, I just showed up. Like I had taken a quick shower beforehand and I showed up, and in 2023 myself is looking back and being like, oh girl, you should have probably been a little more prepared for that moment. But again, like, and I know this isn't the questions that you have down the line, but like, I didn't know how to properly prepare for having sex in that way.
No, and they never, and you're right. It is something we'll continue talking about, but it's so interesting you say that because no one's talking about it. No one's teaching it. No one's, and even like I know for me, my sex education, super minimal, but it was still very heteronormative. It was like penis and vagina sex is all you really heard about. So yeah, if there's anything outside of that, I can imagine, teenage you being like, I took a shower.
Like,
and
I'm gonna show up. And I know that there should be a condom involved, and that's about all that I know. And like, because again, I mean, it outside of like you're saying, outside of like, penis, vagina, condoms, because otherwise you're gonna have a baby, but you only should be having sex to have a baby anyways. So, which is always the weird messaging. Like they spend all the time talking about like briefly talking about condoms and things, like, but don't have kids outside of marriage. And you're like, all right, like I don't.
Oh, the weird is it's so fucking weird, and religion is tied into it, and it's just a whole weird thing.
That's part of the sex positive movement that I'm learning and I'm really enjoying is the fact that they preach proper sex education, right? And the fact that it's supposed to be inclusive. So I'm curious, where did you grow up? Like what state, region?
It was rural Ohio, not too far from like Cedar Point area.
Okay.
So like, I mean, my town population was like 1,000 people when I was growing up.
Okay. What was your actual formal sex education like in school? Like how old were you?
I remember in like, it was like 6th grade. We had some, I remember like we had some educate, like, but it was very, again, it was a lot of like, if you had like, it almost, what was that? Was it Mean Girls where they did it? Where it's like, if you have sex, you will get chlamydia and you will die.
Okay.
Do not have sex.
Some rubbers. There's like a tub going around. Yeah.
Yeah. But like, and like, I mean, and they focus, I think, a lot more on like the puberty aspect of it and like your body going through changes and hormones and these things. But and even at that point, like, I can't remember what all we actually, and I know for like the next couple of years, it was like in like health class, it was always like a lesson for like 1 week where like, we kind of loosely hit on something, but it was also just like, here's pictures of somebody with genital warts. You don't want to get genital warts, do you? So it was weird messaging. And then even later when I had come out and it was all the like, you don't have sex until you're married. I was like, well, legally I can't get married in this country, so it doesn't matter. And I can have sex anyways, because I'm already going to hell by your standards.
Yeah. Speaking of the genital warts, God, I remember a family friend of ours. I was like probably, I don't know, 13, 14 maybe. Like I hadn't had sex at that point. And I didn't even really know like what it was. It was like this thing that I heard about, but I was like, I don't really know like what that looks like, even at 13, 14. But I remember this family friend telling us that she had a friend who had sex with someone, got herpes, and will never have sex again because of it. Like said it like, well, her sex life is over. She'll never have it again. And for years, I mean, literally years, I walked around like terrified. Like if I get herpes, my sex life is fucked. It's over. And now what I know now, I'm like, wow, that is a very extreme thing to say.
A lot of misinformation out there.
And at that time, like there wasn't, at least for me, there wasn't ways to confirm or deny information you were getting, right? Like nowadays, a 13-year-old gets information about sex or gets told like, if you get herpes, you're done and you'll never have sex ever again. And it literally just takes like a Google search to be like, will herpes kill my sex life? And it's like, no, herpes, like this is treatable. You could do this, you could do this. But like when I was growing up, like the only place you had to get information from was what they told you in school and the like awkward conversation you have with your parents at some point about like the birds and the bees, which I'd rather have just had it from the school than like have my mother sit me down with the book and be like, all right, so.
Oh, you guys sat down with a book. Wow.
There was they didn't know how to navigate the conversation. It was all very awkward. I bet like all I remember is that I was just very uncomfortable the entire time and being like, I don't know why we're talking about any of this right now. Like,
that's funny.
What do you think, like, in your opinion, speaking of sex education, what do you think needs to be included in a comprehensive queer affirming education lens, what do you think it needs to include that is not currently included?
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, like I don't like I guess in today's settings, I don't fully know where like what the state of sex education looks like. Like I don't have kids, and I don't know. Like I know like some people who have kids in schools, but
I
um
I will say in Texas, it is abstinence only teaching. Like I have a friend of mine
mhm,
who is a science teacher to high school students. And I guess she in her school, like she's the one who's over, like the 2 weeks of sex education, but the school gives her a script and it's
mhm.
basically abstinence only teaching. And she risks getting fired if she goes off of that script. And so, like, when students have questions, or I guess the way she does it is she'll tell her students, she's like, so this is all I can teach you. But if you ask a question, then I can't not answer it. So, I mean, it's just, that's kind of at least that's how it is here. And it's
That's
probably like
so
that in a
sad that
lot of, it's
it
probably like
has
that in
to
a
be a
lot of
loop around.
states. Yes, it's very
Yeah,
abstinence based.
yeah. I mean, and I think at this point, like there's so much more we know about now than we knew, and that we even had access to when I was growing up and going through all this. That like I mean, we at this point, like I think the data shows like abstinence only programs are ineffective, right? Like people are
Mhm.
gonna have sex, and like what abstinence only ends up doing is creating spaces where then people end up pregnant or people end up getting contracting an STD because they didn't know about the things that they could actually do to prevent those things from happening. It's same. I mean, it's similar like with how people deal with alcohol. Like we tell them like don't drink, and then they go out and get hammered one night. Like they might find themselves in the hospital. They might find them like I work on college campuses, and like I've seen freshmen who like come in and just like let loose because they didn't
Mhm.
know. And I think it's for me, I think the approach of talking about sex with folks needs to come from like a risk reduction lens, right? So talking about here if you engage in this activity, here are the things that may happen, here's the things that may not happen, and here's ways to mitigate the risk of some of these things happening. So pregnancy can happen. Here's how to mitigate some of those things. Here's the things that don't work because people don't know things and they're like, oh, well, if I just pull out at the last possible second, she definitely won't get pregnant. And then that doesn't happen. Like, or they do pull out, but she still gets pregnant or whatever. And so I think approaching everything with that lens of like risk reduction and the sex positivity side of it, of like, it's not something people should be scared of.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that's going to be in 2023 America. I don't think most places are ready to have those kinds of conversations, which means no one's going to get that education until they go to college at a college that would embrace that kind of teaching, which many do. I remember that was where I had like my first like real sex education when it came to queer sex was like at our college. We brought in like queer health educators to like, and they brought in toys, they brought in condoms, they brought in lubes. I saw dental dams, like they had
Oh, I love
everything.
it.
And
Yeah.
then and like that was the first time I was like, oh, and even there they still didn't cover everything, but like they did more than I had ever seen before.
Hey,
Yeah, and I wish, like, when I think of what I wish sex education was, I wish we just did a better job of even defining what sex is, because the definition of penis and vagina intercourse is exactly what keeps education so limited, because that's not what sex is. It's not just
Right.
that, right? Especially for queer folks. I mean, there's more to sex than penis and vagina intercourse. And
Mm-hmm.
it would be nice to even be aware of that, because I think of I think this is like within the Mormon community. Have you heard of soaking?
Yes, I've heard of it, and I know that I'm not going to remember exactly what it is, but I know that I've heard of it.
I haven't, so
Oh yeah.
explain. Yeah.
Soaking is, so the guy is in the girl, but they just don't move. It's like, as long as there's not like thrusting, it's not really intercourse. So it's not really sex. So there's no risk of like STD or pregnancy. And so they're just inside and like not moving, which sounds so fucking stupid. Like to imagine,
Awkward.
like
That
to
sounds
imagine,
awkward.
like, well, we're not having sex, so it's okay. And that's what I mean by like, if we don't define all the things that sex is, then people are going around doing stuff like soaking, thinking I'm in the clear. There's no risk. There's no, and I'm like, oh boy, it's
Wow. Wow.
yeah, wild.
So,
I was just like,
go ahead.
I was just like, also there's just like a level of like enjoyability from that. Like if you're literally just like not moving in any capacity, like that just feels, you're like, what are we doing here? Like,
Well,
you're not
what's the point? This isn't fun. So why are we doing
I
this?
feel like you get the pleasure from the friction of the movement. So I mean, yeah, that doesn't make sense.
yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, from the perspective of young Eric, like teenager
Mhm.
Eric, what would have been something that they could have shared with you, or what would have been something in your sex education that either parent or even formal that they could have said that would have helped your development?
I think a lot of it is just that broader explanation of what sex is, the
Okay.
different ways in which people can have sex. Um, I think that there's levels of things that like a school's never going to get to, like a conversation about douching. Like, they're never going to get to that. Like, if you're a gay man and you're going to bottom, here's how to properly make sure that you do this in a way that is going to be, appropriate. And like, I feel like it's just a level that you're not going to tell 16-year-olds how to do that. I mean, maybe one day they'll have that conversation for kids about that. But like it's all those little things, like you just don't know until like you're in the moment. But I think the biggest things being, just the different ways in which sex can occur again, and what are risk factors, like, and giving people the ability to make informed decisions about how do I want to engage in sexual activity, knowing all the things I know, and what that looks like.
Yeah, that's something I always am wondering. I don't have kids either, but I'm always thinking of what do age appropriate conversations look like? Because like the conversation about like douching to a 16-year-old, part of me is like, that might be a great conversation to have because they're at
Yeah.
that age where teenagers are having sex.
Yep.
And I think if we try to pretend that they're not, we miss all that important stuff. So
Yeah, and the wild thing is the show called Sex Education with is it Gillian Anderson, is like she's like a sex therapist, and then her kid like goes off to like do sex therapy with the
yeah.
school. That's, I think, one of the very few places I've ever seen an actual scene and conversation about douching in like media. Because like the kids are all trying to figure out how to do it, and like some exchange student who's like is like this artsy super cool person is like, oh, I can teach you all about this, and they literally like go through like the steps of it with these kids, and it was hilarious, but also like it's really sad that like a Netflix comedy has more insightful information about sex.
Well, and I've not seen Sex Education, sadly, and it's like on my to watch eventually list, but they consult with sex educators and sex
Mhm.
therapists. And I had an interview like a few months back with someone who was like one of the sex educators who's a consultant on that show. And
Mhm.
that's just so smart. It's like if you're going to write a show about it, what a way to get that information from the experts. So
Right.
That's
yeah,
awesome.
very cool.
That's how I feel about Big Mouth too. I think they're covering topics that, I
Yep.
wish I would have had in school, and not just about sex, but even just your puberty and how your body's changing and things like that.
Yeah.
They were much more detailed than you ever get in a classroom setting.
Like, that show has some of the best descriptions of like depression and OCD and like just like all sorts of things that like, for as like raunchy and crass as that show is, which it is, like the stuff that they're able to get to and talk about is wild, and like all in the best ways possible.
No, I love it. I love it. So, just kind of going forward now
Yep.
throughout your life. So now, was there, whenever you actually started diving deep into the gay community and really started dating and having sex, were
Mhm.
there any misconceptions, anything that you found that you're like, you thought about going into it one way, but it flipped?
I'm trying to think if there's things that like I don't know if there's like any like specific things where it's like I went into it thinking one thing and kind of came out thinking other, like specifically differently. I think for me the big thing was always just like I kind of think I kind of approached a lot of it of like I just don't know what I don't know, and like learning what you, I think that maybe part of it is like learning what you like or don't like, and like, I know some of this is coming down the line in some of the questions, but like figuring out like, do I enjoy being a top more? Do I enjoy bottoming more? Do I enjoy both? What are other aspects of non-penetrative sex that I really enjoy? And even some of the more like the personality you bring to the space. So like, do I tend to be more of a dominant personality when it comes to sex? Do I tend to be more submissive in different ways, or does it depend on the person or the situation? And so I think for me, it was just a lot of exploring and kind of being open to like what was out there and seeing what kinds of things I could kind of learn about myself. And I think a lot through undergrad, it was very like, we were all still very like, I still don't fully know what all I should be doing. I know I have condoms and I know I have lube. And those are the two more things that I had when I was in high school in terms of knowledge. But I think there was still a lot of like just that openness to explore, which I think is one of the things that I've always appreciated about kind of queerness as it relates to sex, which is kind of just this exploring yourself and being open to some more of that, the conversations, are open to more of just trying things. Because I think for a lot of people, when I forget if it was a comedian that I was like, maybe Margaret Cho might have talked about it, but it was like, if you are like belittled and demeaned and thought less of because of all these different things that people just assume that you're doing, like if you're going to assume that I'm doing them, then I'm going to go do them and enjoy them.
You might as well, right?
Like if you're going to call me all sorts of nasty things and tell me that I'm going to hell because I'm taking it up the ass, well, like, cool, let me go take it up the ass, because if I'm already going to hell anyways, and you're going to say all this about me anyhow, I might as well be enjoying myself while it's all happening. Right? Like I'm not going to stop you from saying these things. Fuck it. Let's see what the big fuss is.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of like exploring and figuring out what you like, that was one of the questions I had for you as far as like top, bottom, or versatile or verse. Do you let me give you some preface of like why I'm asking this question, because in my, like, as a sex therapist, I see a lot of couples, and I do have some queer couples, but I do work more with more straight couples. And so maybe I'm asking this from like a straight lens, but as far as like being open and exploring, I have lots of partners that are very sexually anxious and everything has to be exactly right. And I only do these things. And this is the only thing I mean, they're very like boxed in. So when we talk about exploring, I've had clients where it takes a lot of time and guidance and empathy to get them to like open up a little bit. And so my question about, top, bottom, verse is, do you feel like anyone ever gets caught in the box of I'm a top, I'm a bottom, instead of just being, here's my preference, but I'm also open? Yeah, I just didn't know if you thought people got boxed in.
I mean, I think definitely people get, I think there's a couple layers here, right? I think there are people who do get boxed in, who like maybe they tend to bottom more often, or they tend to top more often, because either like for topping, I mean, and again, I know these are some other things coming down the line in conversation, but like when you're engaging in sex, to be a top is a little bit easier than to be a bottom, just because of what it goes into, like, make sure you're kind of in the right space physically to do that. So like if someone's texting me and is like, hey, do you want to come over and fuck me? I'm like, yeah, I can be there in 10. Like, let me just like maybe rinse off real quick. I'm good. Whereas if someone texts me and is like, hey, I want to fuck you, can you come over? I'd be like, do you have 45 minutes to an hour that I can like make sure I'm right? And like, then I can be over. And like, sometimes it's a matter of that happens. And then you get to the 45-minute mark and you're like, all right, I'm about to head over. And they're like, I'm not feeling it. So I think that there are ways that folks, when they engage in certain behavior or certain activities, that I think people can sometimes box them in. And if you talk about bottoming once and suddenly everybody's like, oh, well, you're only a bottom. And you're like, I mean, no, like, do I greatly enjoy it? Like, do I also top? Sure.
Yeah.
But I think the other side of it is, I do think that there are folks who find great comfort in being on one of those sides and have learned that that is their comfort space and that's what they enjoy. And especially for bottoming, I think there are people who like have tried it before and just it's not been comfortable, or it may not have gone well, or for them physically it just might be more challenging. And especially depending on your partner and what their what they're bringing to the table, we'll say. Because sometimes that can be hindering too. Like if your top shows up and they're like 9 inches and girthy, you're like, well,
Yeah,
I
well,
will I will do my best
uh-huh.
and I will see how this goes. Um, so yeah, I think there's a little bit of some people getting boxed in, and there's been more conversation these days also around what people refer to as like being a side, meaning they don't particularly enjoy anal intercourse in any capacity, and would much rather focus on the foreplay or oral or other things, but never actually want to engage in like penetrative sex. And I think that's a big thing that is a challenge for a lot of folks too right now, is like when someone says like I don't want to have penetrative sex, you're like, but why? Like I don't understand. I think that's been an ongoing conversation that has been rolling out that I think is really good and productive. But again, I think it's challenging because it boxes people in different ways.
Yeah, from my perspective, as far as like in the lesbian community, I definitely see, just like in any community, heterosexual too, there are people have boundaries and
Mhm.
they have no problem, and after they've done some exploration and sharing those boundaries. But then at the same time, yeah, like you said, there's times where a lot of people are just stuck on the labels, and this is my
Yep.
label, this is how I am, we're not going past here. So I feel like it's the same in the heterosexual community as it is in the queer community, with just boundaries, labels, and
It's kind of like, how do you
Yeah.
define a boundary versus like rigidity, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
so
And oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
But just as a lesbian, because this is a convo that's way out of my left field. You said 45 minutes if you decide to bottom. So now I have two questions really. So what is gay man sex just in general? Because you said some people don't do the penetrative
Mhm.
thing. So there's a lot of ambiguity in lesbian community. Even we can't describe what lesbian sex is. It's not like uniform across the board. So for you, what is gay sex?
Yeah, and I mentioned this at the very beginning of the recording, but I'll say it now as we're asking this question. Like I will say that I speak from my own experience, and that there are a lot of people who approach all of this in very different ways and have different definitions, which is also what it makes it more challenging. I know people will joke about when you like talk about dating apps and like people talk about Grinder, and it's like one of the default questions is like, "What are you into?" Or like it'll just be like "into?" question mark. But like I don't know, I find those questions helpful for me when I'm talking to someone to understand, not maybe necessarily like, okay, so when you arrive you will kiss me at the door and then we will do this and we will do this and we will do this, but it's a good conversation for me of like, okay, so like what are the things that you tend to be more into, what are the things that maybe don't work for you. If we're kind of swapping some lists, we see some common spaces, and like it gives us a starting point to figure out where we go from there. But I think for me, I don't know. I think defining what gay sex is, or how I define sex for myself, I think a lot of times it's being physical with another person, who is more often either male identifying, or at this point like non-binary or gender non-conforming, but maybe presents more masculine, or presents in ways or engages in ways that I am attracted to. And so I think it's that, because I could go hook up with somebody, come back and be like, oh my God, like we had sex. And people are like, okay, like who fucked you? And I'm like, well, this time nobody fucked anybody. Like there wasn't penetrative sex. Like, we fooled around and there was some oral, or there was some, jerking each other off. I went and hooked up with people and like nobody came, but it was still sex. Like we still had a good time. Um, but like we just got to a point where we were like, it's been an hour and a half. I'm kind of good.
Yeah.
Um, Also, in 2023, there's also the added layer of depression and anxiety being skyrocketing through a lot of folks, and wonderful SSRIs not always being conducive to being able to reach a conclusion when it comes to an orgasm.
Yeah.
And so like I think there's different ways where it's like sometimes you just hit a point of I'm kind of good.
I love that statement of like it was still sex. I
Yeah.
love it because um and again, like I'm going back through my framework of work and working with couples, and I'm going to talk about like erectile dysfunction really quickly. When I
Mhm.
have clients that have or struggle to get an erection, sex is totally off the table, which is it's surprising, because why do all the things have to stop just because there's not an erection for the purpose of intercourse at play? And people won't define people. I've had clients who, when I ask them, well, I'm like, so does that mean that you've been doing nothing? Well, we've been doing some stuff, but we haven't been having sex. And they'll be having oral sex and still not define that. They're like, but we're still not having sex. So there's this whole umbrella where, I love what you said, it is still sex, whether there's an orgasm, whether there's intercourse. I mean, why not?
Well, and I think on the other side of it, like, if I'm fooling around with some guy and someone's going to be, yelling at me about having sex with other people, sex with men or whatever else, like, they're going to yell at me for that just as much as they're going to yell at me about having like penetrative anal sex. Like, I'm still going to get, they're still going to label it that way on me. And for me, and again, I think it's that range of, it's more about the person that you're with and like the experience that you're going to have together and what that means for both of you. Sometimes you both come, sometimes maybe only one of you does, maybe both, maybe neither of you do, but like, you're still doing all sorts of things. And I always laugh when people are like, oral sex doesn't count as sex. I'm like, can you say the first two words again? Yeah. And they're like oral sex. I'm like, what was that second word you said? And then they just stare at you. And I'm just saying.
Yeah.
No, accurate. Actually, that's one of the reasons that I asked that question specifically, is because I've seen in the past where especially queer women, two women engage in a sexual experience, and if one identifies as straight, a lot of times that experience doesn't count to her at all. And whereas the queer person, the person actually who identifies as queer, that was a sexual experience, like that's what they would consider sex. So I've seen it to where like it was a coming out type sexual experience into the queer person. That was literally their coming out story. That was the first time they ever had sex. And unfortunately, because of the partner that they identify as straight, they discount that experience completely, which is, kind of sad.
Yeah. How I am curious, speaking like 45 minutes to get ready to bottom, how do you prepare to be a bottom?
Yeah. I saw the question on the list and I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. So I think that what I'll say is I think two kind of different things that I do, but also I know that other folks will do as well. I know that one for folks is trying to kind of be mindful of your own digestion and your own kind of how you day to day, like what kinds of things are you taking in. I know a lot of my friends, myself included, will do fiber supplements just to help keep your digestive tract kind of moving and flowing and doing what it needs to do. But then when it comes to like actually getting ready to go have sex with somebody, and if I know that I'm going to be bottoming it, sometimes even if I'm not, but like I know it was also another question on your list, but like if I expect there going to be some sort of anal play, like if someone's really down in like really into rimming or other things where I'm like, I still might go through the process because I want to just kind of make sure that like it's a good experience for all of us. But it involves douching. So it's like, I've got like this little bulb thing that has a little like, I don't know, like a thing on the end of it that you fill the bulb up with water, put the thing in your butt, let all the water get up in there, and then sit on the toilet and let it all do its thing. And realistically, I say 45 minutes, because I mean, sometimes it just depends on what's all in your body at any given moment. Sometimes you can, you could do that process and be ready in like 10-15 minutes. I know for some folks, the fiber supplements can sometimes be really helpful with that because it keeps everything kind of moving and keeps you, I guess the best way to describe it is like kind of keeps you clean on the inside. But depending on what you've eaten over the course of the day, what you've been doing, it could just take longer for, the phrase is always like when the water runs clear, like that's what you're looking for, when the water runs clear.
Okay.
But like and I think the hard part is like everyone's bodies are different and like how your own internal organs process things and do things is just different. And so sometimes and again, that can be some of the discomfort for people. They may not want to bottom because that is not always the most pleasant experience to have to deal with. And so, but yeah, doing all of that, doing a full shower, making sure that you're, kind of all together and ready to go for when somebody is putting their tongue on your butthole. You're like, I don't I want to make sure that I've done everything I can, that it's in a good spot.
So do you like rim jobs? Is that
I
something that
love
you
them.
enjoy?
I love them
Okay.
so much. Like
Yeah.
I'll talk to people and they're like I've talked to people who like will want me to top for them, but they're like, but like I wanna rim you. And I'm like, absolutely. Like, let's fucking go. Like,
I'm
let's
down.
do
Let's
it.
go.
But I do think some of that comes from like I think there's a bit obviously because all the sex education that we get is narrowly defined for straight people. And no, they're not gonna ever tell a straight man, like, let someone play with your butt. Because like, that's a whole power dynamic and sexism and all those other fun things. But like there's stuff in there that makes you feel good. Like you have a prostate, like you have spots in there that feel really good if somebody is doing something to you in that way. So I think there's a lot of that like it feels good.
Yeah. And a lot of straight men are so afraid that if they like butt play, it means they're gay. It's like
100%.
they're like, oh my God, it's gonna mean, and it's like, well, no, you don't have to do that with another man. You can
Right.
enjoy it.
Right. Like it should be more about the person that you're with and what you're engaging in and what that looks like. And I know this was on your list, but I know one thing that is I think comes up within the queer community, especially amongst I'll say, like, speaking from my experience with mostly queer men, is conversations around like trans men and engaging in sex with somebody who doesn't have a penis. And what does that mean for you? What does that mean for, your own identity and all these things? And everyone will be like, oh, I can't do that because like, that's, I always get so miffed when people are like, especially, well, when I say people, when gay men are like, oh, vaginas, like they're so gross. I'm like, stop, like first you're in your 30s, stop it. But like second, like there's an entire population within our community that have vaginas that are also looking to have sex with men and like are men, presents as
Yeah.
men. And I know that was one that like the first time I hooked up with somebody who was a trans guy, I was like, I don't know. I've no one has ever taught me what I'm supposed to do, what feels good, and I think for me when I'm having sex with somebody, my default is always to kind of play around and figure out what gets them, like what seems to get them excited or what gets them going, and then like hone in on that. And like I was like, all right, I guess that's what we got to do, because this is all very foreign to me. But
good on you for being open and even like having the conversation. Cause I was just thinking, something you said earlier, like if someone's coming over and kind of asking them questions, like, what do they like? What are they more into? Or if it's someone who does have a vagina, like, what would you like me to do? I'm new here. Straight people don't have those conversations. I know I'm speaking from my personal experience, but I can safely assume they are not having those conversations. Like I think back to, I mean, I with like my husband, I would now, but I'm talking about like when you first, have sex with someone. I don't think I've ever had that conversation with anyone.
Really?
Never, never. And it's not that I was like necessarily afraid, but it's just kind of this unspoken rule of like, well, what's there to talk about? You know what to do,
right.
right?
Well, and especially with stereotyping heterosexual couples, it's very much like he's not going to go down on you, but like he's probably going to expect you to go down on him.
Yes.
And then he's
Like,
going to put his
yeah.
penis into your vagina, and like that's the formula. Like that's all we do. Meanwhile, I feel like I'm on apps talking to people and like being like, all right, so like, what are you into? Like, okay, this, and this. Okay, like, do you have any kinks? Do you want, like, what are your hard? I literally, like, what are your hard stops? Like, where do you draw the line? Because you don't want to be surprised and like show up somewhere and someone's like, "Ooh, I'm really into piss play," and you're like, "Ah, that's one of my boundaries."
Yeah.
But like, I mean, I feel like I know more about people's sexual proclivities than sometimes I know their actual name. Like, I've hooked up with people that I could tell you everything about what turns this person on and off. And then if you're like, and what's their name? I'd be like, blowjob 69. I don't know. It was on Grindr. I didn't catch it.
Oh, I mean, I actually really do want to go into the subject because your community is very different from my community, where my community, to be honest, sex is actually Netflix and chill. Like it's literally the actual Netflix and chilling part. It's the cuddling part. That's usually what we do. It takes actually usually a very long time for, like, one night stands are not part of are not a typical stereotypical part of our community. It's usually, it takes a lot of what would you call it? Bonding
Yeah.
type thing. So in the gay community, is it very common for you guys to just purely have a sexual experience only, like relationship, a sexual relationship?
Yeah. And I would say, I think I will, I don't want to paint like huge broad strokes. I would say I definitely know a number of my friends who I have friends that are, maybe a little bit more in terms of like some of that, like they don't, hookup culture isn't for them. They're not as open to some of those experiences, but I do think there's a level of, you know, again, I mean, I don't know if it's like a hormones thing, like, we just have more like, I want to have sex with somebody kind of energy. I'm not sure. Um, but I've got a number of friends that like that's part of the culture. I mean, I'm assuming that's why we have as many different apps and websites and such things to find sex, versus perhaps the lesbian community, which doesn't have as many, if any, like that are solely specific about just hooking up. And even some of ours try to have pretenses, like Grindr for the longest time tried to have a pretense of like, oh, like this is a dating app and you can meet people, like, and they only recently added like, what are you looking for, and like added like hooking up as an actual option with it, and that was literally within, I think, the last month.
Wow. I
It
can't believe
used to
that was
just it
so
used to
recent.
say looking for right now. But they finally like changed the language to like actually say it. But it's, yeah, I mean, we definitely have, I think, a lot more of that is probably pronounced within queer men and our community than I'm sure than straight, like I'm sure straight men are trying to achieve what we're doing. Um,
Well, I think the difference is, and again, this is from my personal experience and I guess my view of the world, like and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but when I think of an app like Grinder and you go into
mhm.
it like you're gonna hook up, there still has to be this like level of respect with someone you're hooking up with. I know for me as a straight woman, a lot of straight men don't fucking respect me. Like when I was on the apps and they wanted to hook up, it was not like, hey, you're hot and I'm hot and we're attracted to each other and we should have sex and it'd be this great experience. The vibe was very much like, I want to fuck you, and so you need to do that for me. And I don't
Oh,
really
I mean,
respect
that
all that
that
much.
definitely exists for us too. Like I definitely get those where it's like I want to fuck you, you'd be lucky to have me, and I'm like, am I?
Yeah.
Like, is that real? I think that I've been painting my own experience with a lot of this, like perhaps rose colored glasses. I think there is a lot of toxicity on apps in the hookup culture in all of those spaces. I think for me, it's about finding people within those spaces that are operating at the same space that you are,
Yeah.
whatever that space is. And finding the people that are respectful and that want to enjoy themselves and want to have a good time, and recognizing that there are a lot of people that don't for different reasons. And you do the thing where you're like talking with somebody and you do the picture swapping where it's like, all right, like let's send our nudes back and forth. And then like, the number of people I know where it's like you send nudes back and forth and then the person blocks you as soon as they see your like full body and you're like, oh, okay, cool. My
Uh,
body image is doing great today. Great. So like, I mean, all of that stuff happens on apps and on spaces as well. And I know a lot of people who need to like disconnect from things and take time away from them because it can be not the best experience. And I'll say, I know for like people of color, especially, like being on apps is oftentimes a very like trying experience because it's either people not wanting you because of your skin color, or people fetishizing you because of your skin color, and then trying to find that spot in the middle where it's people that genuinely just want to like hook up with you as a person, um can be a lot harder to navigate. And that, like, for me being a you know white masculine presenting person, that's, I think, a very different experience for me than for other people that are in the same app or on the same websites.
yeah. Speaking of all of this, of being on the apps and finding people to hook up with and being in your community, and even going back to, when we were talking about like teenage you and trying to figure everything out. And you may have already kind of answered this a little bit, but I'm just curious, has being a gay man had an impact on your mental health? And if so, what would you say the impact has been?
I mean, the very short answer is yes, absolutely, 100%. but I think at different points it can be different things, right? Like we talked about like going through coming out and being a high schooler, and like while it was never articulated, like the toll that was taking on my own mental health at that time, of like, again, having to think about and live through in your brain the experience of like, okay, what if I tell my mom that I'm gay and she kicks me out the house?
Yeah.
Right? Like having to operate in those spaces and not really having any space, and or having even supports of like other queer people to be like, hey, like if I get kicked out, where am I going? What am I doing? So I think that, that chunk of my life was a lot of that. I think there's also been, I mean, body image is a huge thing within queer circles, and I think that's probably true across multiple of the alphabet soup, right? Like I'm sure within the lesbian community that there's body image in different ways than it is for maybe gay men. um but like all of that still exists, and I think it has the ability to take a toll on you. And I think as much as, there's definitely times that I'm like, I think I'm going to just pause on chatting on apps, or I'm going to pause on doing some different things. The past week or so, I'm tired of like, sending a message, sending photos, and then like the person being like, oh, never mind. Or
Mm.
like, and I think that that has the ability to take a toll on you. And I think at the same time, like that's where I start trying to build, like I've got, I think one of the things that I love about being gay is our openness to things of like people in open relationships, or people that are exploring polyamorous relationships as well. And I think I have a really wonderful group of friends that also at times are people that I sleep with, that are in open relationships or poly relationships, where it's like I might have, a group of friends over one night to play board games. And then the next night, one of them comes over, their husband's off doing something else. And like the two of us are getting naked in my bedroom. And like, there's something refreshing about like, this is a person that I know, and we don't necessarily have like romantic feelings towards each other, but like I get to enjoy the act of sex and have it with my friend. And then turn around and invite everybody back over the next weekend for, just hanging out in a completely non-sexual way. So I think there's some of that too, that when I'm like, the apps are kind of not being great, there are people that I'm still getting certain needs and things that I want met in different ways, but without having to navigate all of the hoops and loops and everything that you go through when you're trying to be on an app of some sort.
I love it.
Actually, that was ridiculously relatable, because I too feel the same thing. One thing that I think is very much a benefit about being proud of being queer, just being accepting of, your queer identity, is the fact that you no longer have to subscribe to what is considered normal, appropriate boundaries, that little box. And it just, yeah, like you said, it makes it to where you have an openness to explore anything sexual. You have an openness to not follow traditions, like on a wedding. You have, like, you just have that ability to, it doesn't matter what society says, because I'm already wrong in society's,
Yep.
viewpoint. So I'm just going to do me, and we're going to figure that out that way. And I absolutely love that portion, but it did take me a really long time to get there, to where I was able to not care about tradition, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. And that, I mean, I think that's always the biggest thing too, where it's like, people are like, and I think there's always levels of like, I don't go into work and talk about like, oh yeah, like my, this friend of mine came over and like we hooked up, and then like, their partner and I all went out to dinner afterwards, kind of thing. Like, I don't think we necessarily like, I don't like talk about it in some of those settings, but I do think there is such a vibe of like, you all have spent so much time telling me that I'm like breaking all these norms, like, and people being like, oh, like this is not what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, I literally don't care. Like, I don't know what you want from me. Like, I'm not, I literally, I have gone to a wedding before where like I met the grooms because we had a three-way.
Oh, yeah.
And like we nearly had a three-way over their wedding weekend. Like I think there was like, it's one of those, like, right, like it's such a different culture, I think, that really embraces all of those things that we were told we weren't supposed to do, we weren't supposed to be, we weren't supposed to have. And I think in undergrad, when people would always, talk to people about being gay or whatever, and you always got the question like, if you could take a pill and be straight again, like would you give it all up? Like, would you change? And like at the time when you're like ashamed of yourself, you're like, maybe. nowadays I'm like, no, I've heard all the things that you talk about. Like, that's boring. Like, I want to like, I like a couple weeks ago, I went to an orgy at somebody's house. Like, and I love gay people because I went to this orgy and they literally had a bag check in their little like foyer when you walked into the apartment. Like, they handed you a brown paper bag, you put all your stuff in it. They left all the bags in the kitchen. They had condoms, poppers, lubes all over their apartment, porn playing on all the televisions.
Oh, that sounds like fun. Okay.
And I was like, I literally left and I texted one of my friends and I was like, I love gay people. Like, I just love us so much because like it was just such a fun space of like we're not confined by this idea of what you're supposed to do. And that one was nice because like I think there was a lot of it, the diversity of it I thought was also kind of nice, where like there was a lot of different body types, a lot of different it wasn't just a bunch of like ripped white dudes. Like, it was an actual welcoming space for a lot of different people, which again, not always the norm and not always the case, but it was just one of those things where like, again, I just walked out and I was like, I literally just went to someone's house and they handed me a bag. Like, I did a bag check.
Well, it sounds very safe, like emotionally safe too. Like there's trust there, and it just seems like a very, like you said, welcoming, like I know I'm gonna be okay here and have a lot of fun.
Yeah. And if you and they were like, if at any point you want to leave, like, feel free. Like, they literally like, we have water all over, like they like their little like wine bar thing was like full of like bottled waters that you could just grab. Like, it was just such a like it felt ridiculous a little bit at the time, but you're like, this is just so refreshing of like that someone would do this and like trust about, like, there was probably 40 of us in this like apartment. Like, and I wasn't worried about my stuff being stolen. I wasn't worried about like how people were interacting, and like, and sure, like while you're walking around, like there might have been some people who like maybe didn't take to you, like you walked over to like initiate something and they kind of like, but like everything was done in a way where it wasn't like, no one was like, oh, you're disgusting, don't touch me. But it was just kind of like, you got the vibe from the person of like, I'm into you, I'm not into you. And if they weren't, there were 38 other people you could you know.
That sounds like a very safe space, which is what I love. Yeah.
Are there any I don't know, toys or types of lubrication that you recommend just to anyone who's listening in, that I don't know, can make sex an even more enjoyable experience?
I mean, I guess speaking from like my own lens, and making the assumption that if this is, two men that are engaging in sex together, I mean, lubes are always tricky, right? And I think there's parts where being in 2023, there's a lot more, I think, openness and conversations around condoms or not using condoms, which also then makes a big difference on what kind of lubes you might be able to use, right? Like, because water-based lubricants are what you should be using for condoms. But like, I mean, I've shared enough about myself. So I'm like, I'm on like, I'm on PrEP. So that means I take a pill every day. That greatly reduces my risk of contracting HIV. I also, now there's a newer thing that's rolling out called DoxyPep, which is kind of a low grade dosage that it's chlamydia. I think it's chlamydia and gonorrhea. That like, if you were to get one of those things like this, they would normally give you a higher dosage of this. But now I literally have a pill bottle on my, literally next to my computer right here. That after I engage in a sexual encounter, within 3 days, if I take 2 of these pills, it greatly reduces the risk that if I was exposed to certain STIs, I will not contract them.
Okay.
Which is a brand new, like literally I just was at my doctor's maybe a couple weeks ago. And like, he was like, oh, he's like, I know you're sexually active. Let me get you on DoxyPep because this is super important. And, you have it available to you now because that's a thing that we can do.
I didn't know about that. I'm like learning something new hearing this.
And it's, I mean, and this is very much like, I think I've only started hearing about this maybe within the past like 3 months. And the healthcare facility that I go to is very queer operated. And so it's known for being like a premier LGBTQ space. So I'm not surprised that like they're rolling something out there that like doesn't pop up in other places yet. But so for me, with all that to be said, I don't always use condoms. Depends on the conversation with the partner and what their comfort levels and what they want to use and all of those things. But if you're not using condoms, oil-based lubricant is infinitely better in my experience of using it for someone to be inside of me. Like it just works better for me. And then I would say, I think for toys, I think a lot of those are about figuring out, what, not just like what your goals are, but like what you're trying to work towards. Because if you're
Yeah.
trying to bottom more and be better at that, then like finding some dildos or other like or even like anal plugs that you can just put in and have kind of help that experience, give you that experience of something being there, to try and open you up a little bit more if you're trying to do some of that. um if you're in, I remember when COVID hit and I was like, well, I'm not having sex for like 6 months at this point. Like I went on a buying spree. um I now have like, I have a fleshlight, which is basically like, that's for like if you wanted to top in some capacity, it's basically just this like large shaft thing that has a hole at the front of it that looks like an asshole, and like you lube it up. And um but I've got those, I've got dildos, I've got vibrators. I literally went on a spending spree because I was like, when March 2020 hit and they're like, don't touch another human being. I was
You're
like,
I'm having sex with myself for a while. So
I was like, I can only jerk off so many times on my own. Like I need something else. But I do think a lot of it is trial and error almost, which it's expensive to buy things that maybe don't work for you. But I think and I would like start small. Like start small. Like if you're like, I want to try bottoming, I'm gonna buy this like 10-inch dildo that's the girth of my forearm. Like it's not going to go well. Like it's not going to be a good time for you. And there's nothing wrong with like grabbing smaller sizes of things and trying to work your way up towards what you're looking for. And I think it's always hard because you don't always have like physical stores to go to, and you have to rely on the internet for figuring out what that is, or what you want. Which again, when it shows up at your door, you're like, oh, apparently I've been lying about what 6 inches is my whole life. This is
No, that's all very good advice. I love it. And I hear you about the oil-based lubricants. It's just more moisturizing. I don't know. I hear you on this.
yeah. Like I feel like the best way I can describe it is like the water one feels like it almost gets like a little sticky after a little bit. Like it feels, after you're using it for a little bit, like it just doesn't quite have that slickness that like an oil-based does.
Because
Whereas
the
like
water, the water, a lot of the water like soaks into your skin, but not all of it. So that it
Yeah.
is kind of like whatever's left is a little sticky. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I'm the contrary opinion here. I actually prefer the water-based.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I
oil-based.
also think some of that might also come into like, again, what folks are trying to do and what your own body is able to do. Whereas like where I'm putting things, it might be a little bit more like I need a little extra, a little more. Versus perhaps where you're putting things, you might have some spaces where you're kind of generating some of your own lubricant in different ways, that might work better with the water than perhaps it does with the oil based.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. That's probably why. So I want to get
really my really delicate way of being like, I put stuff up my ass and you put stuff in your vagina, and those are different things.
But I want to get back to the error part of the trial and error, because
Yeah.
you did say how your first time you may not have been ready. So I go into that a little bit more. Like what were you?
Oh, that was meaning like I didn't douche. Like I didn't know about douching. I hadn't douched. I think most of my college years, like that wasn't a conversation that anyone had with me and like told me like this is what you need to do in order to like properly have anal. I'm trying to remember when I first started actually douching. It was like, this is embarrassing because like it's been like I went through much of my adult life without having done it. Like I was also like I was in a committed relationship for many, many years with like a singular person, and we weren't open. We didn't have those things. So like, and he was very much the bottom in that relationship. So for me, I wasn't doing that as much for a good chunk of time. But it was a while before like it suddenly was like, oh, like I should probably be doing this a little differently. And I guess I just kind of, maybe I lucked out in a lot of my experiences through undergrad when I did engage in being a bottom. I did not run into issues in terms, and when I say issues, it literally just means like you're getting shit on somebody's dick. Like that's the big concern. And so like, I don't know if I just was fortunate that I don't know if my body was just in a good space where I was okay, and like there weren't things that were getting on the condom or anything else. But as I started like engaging in more sexual activity after I left my partner and kind of gone through some different things, I was like, oh, like that might actually be a good idea. Cause I think I literally just heard someone was like talking about it. Like, oh, like I'm going to go bottom for someone. I have to get ready. And I was like, you seem to be doing more than I'm
Yeah, you're
doing.
like, wait, what do you mean by
Let us
me?
compare notes. Which also is the thing I love about just being gay with and having lots of gay friends is like having those conversations and like being open about like, hey, like, excuse me. I was like, oh, like I was doing this thing the other day and like this felt a little bit weird. Like, oh, well, if you do it this way, it feels different. Like you like sit down and are able to have more of those open conversations that like straight men definitely aren't having amongst themselves, probably. Being like, oh, dude, the other day, like, I did this to my woman, I did this and it felt great, or she did this and it was great. Like I don't think it happens in like the same way. And that's stereotyping of me, but that's kind of, I don't know. I think there's a lot of those conversations that we know that we didn't get the education on all of it.
Mm.
So I think there's a more openness to like talk through some of that and be like, okay, so here's what you got to do. Ain't nobody else telling you. So like, let me be the one to like walk you through it.
Yeah.
And was that the only, I guess, mistakes that you've ever made or you've encountered, whether it be from your perspective or the other person?
I've definitely had a lot of times where like sex just didn't like go as planned. Like it just, wasn't great, didn't go well. I think I think the only other one is just sometimes being like, oh yeah, I can definitely handle this one. I can definitely handle you. And then getting into it and being like, nope. Definitely cannot. You're like, I want to, I really, really want to. And I do, there was a time that I think there was somebody that like, I think sometimes like you're unsure to what degree there should be some discomfort and, or even a little bit of pain, because I think there's times that like, I know one of the first times I like really saw queer sex on TV was the show Queer as Folk, from like the late 90s, early 2000 era. And like, I mean, the pilot episode is in my brain, like one of my most like iconic episodes of television, because it stays with me. And like, literally that episode taught me what like rimming was. That episode was the first time I saw someone putting a condom on to have anal sex. And I remember like the first time I watched it, one of the things is like this older guy is having sex with this younger guy who's never had sex before. And like when he goes to slide inside of him, it like he says something about like, does it always hurt? And he says a little bit every time. And I think more so meaning just like you're putting, it just takes a second for you to like maybe relax a little bit and be
okay. Yeah.
Not like it's supposed to hurt a ton, but when you're in the midst of something and you're like, oh, this like doesn't feel super great, but like if I just like, relax or whatever, I'll be fine. I definitely had the instance before where like I wasn't, and which resulted in like a small like anal tear. Which those are, I think those are the challenging parts where it's like if you don't do everything well, you could have something that then you're like, oh well, now I can't bottom for like a while and I need to like let myself heal.
There's like actual like physical harm or injury.
Yeah. And it's never something I think that is like, it's not a malicious thing that somebody's like, they fucked you so hard that like, they intentionally tried to harm you. I mean, that I'm sure that happens, but I think more often than not, it's like either you just weren't relaxed enough to like do that. Maybe the lube, like I've had definitely times where like lube wasn't good enough for like the size that we were working with. And you're like, but like there are ways that if that your body and someone else's body may not mesh in some of those things.
Ignorant lesbian question here for both of you, actually. So would you guys say that there is like an aspect of kind of pushing through a level of pain there? Because for me, I get to pick the size that I want.
For me, maybe a tiny bit of that, but it shouldn't last too long. Like if I mean, I guess just like share personally, I've had anal sex before. I don't personally enjoy it very much. And the partner I was with at the time was getting impatient at how long it was taking me to like want him to go in a little bit further because it did hurt.
Mhm.
And so I can't tell if it was like, did I not enjoy it because I just didn't enjoy it, or was he kind of an asshole and I was like tired of, tired of like someone being impatient with me. Like, I don't know. But I know for at least like anal that it was pretty painful to me. So I was like, no way. But if I think about like vaginal intercourse, if it hurts a little bit going in, but then if I can like, if I'm able to in my head be like, just relax a little bit, you're okay, and then I relax and I feel fine, that would be my definition of pushing through, where I think it would be
Mhm.
okay. Where I would say it wouldn't be okay is if I'm telling myself, just relax, it's going to be okay, and it continues to hurt. That's when
Yeah.
I would kind of be like, okay, I need to stop. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, and the wild thing is that there's definitely people that like I've hooked up with before that are on the larger side. And like, there's been times that I've hooked up with them and literally has not even been a thought that crossed my mind. Like we would do it. Like I was fine. They were great. Like we all had a good time. And then there's other times that they might try. And, sometimes I do think for me, like at least with my body, I do think there might be times where like if I'm overly stressed and you're like holding a lot of things in, like
Mm.
it's literally about like relaxing and like letting your body relax and if you're clenched, like nothing's going to go in, and if it does, it's not going to feel great. And so like I think there have been times where I've just not been in the right, like sometimes that right headspace to like be able to do that. I know one thing that is coming up, I think more in the gay community is the use of poppers. Which for folks listening or whatever that haven't encountered those, they're just like they're literally like little jar like little bottles. If you Google, you can't just like buy them outright. You can't go anywhere and say, "Can I have poppers?" You have to ask for like VHS cleaner, which is the most hilarious thing. But they're inhalants, and the idea is that when you do them, you get a little bit of a rush, but then B also certain you're literally your ass like relax, like your whole relaxes a little bit, which can then be helpful for somebody fucking you.
A good tip, actually. Yeah.
And like, I mean, and of course, like I'm sure like medical professionals and all those things, like there's, you shouldn't be doing things that are inhalants and some of that stuff. But I mean, I use them sometimes because sometimes it's helpful. I know some people just use them during sex in general. Like it doesn't even have to be about anal sex. It's just sometimes that little bit of that rush that you get from them, that can feel good or can make things a little bit more heightened and it's only like a few seconds. It's not like it's a sustained, hour long feeling. It's literally like 30 seconds at most.
Well, and it's kind of like, I mean, this is like a little bit of a stretch, but people do smoke weed to help them relax, and that
Mhm.
makes the sex better. Because I think if you're not relaxed, or you're really stressed, or you're really anxious, like the mental piece matters a
Yeah.
ton. And not even necessarily with anal sex, but with like having an orgasm. Like I have female clients who they might say, I don't really enjoy oral sex or clitoral stimulation. I never have an orgasm. And then I find out that every time they have sex, they're super anxious and stressed and body is tight. And, so it's like your partner could be doing all the amazing things, but you're not in a place to let it happen.
Right.
So it matters a lot.
Other than poppers, do you have any other tips that you practice that kind of help you relax that you could share with, audience members?
I mean, I at that point, I think other than that, like my biggest thing is literally just I think mentally trying to like, it's like deep breaths, relax, like, and I think there's a level of like how comfortable are you feeling with the person who's about to put themselves inside of you, and like sometimes if you're not feeling it and that stresses you out, that clenches you up, that's just as telling as like I feel super comfortable with this person. I mean, rimming also is a spot where like that is super helpful for folks. Like, I have had times where like people will rim me and do it for a long enough period of time that they haven't needed to use lube for anal sex, between like rimming and then just like the pre-cum that they are producing, like the two things kind of working together has not required lube at certain times. It's rare that happens, but like those are again like and rimming and some of those things are things that they're gonna potentially relax you. They're gonna open you up more. You're literally spitting and licking on the spot. You want something to go in. So you're literally producing like some lubricant on that spot. And again, sometimes you'll definitely need more, but good, like, I think the challenge is when sometimes you, especially tops, feel like, oh, like we've made out for 5 minutes. I can literally just put my dick inside of you now. And you're like, no, no, no. Like you've gotta, like some people, yes, you might be able to do that. For me, that does not suffice. So
Yeah.
you need to do more.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on. You have
Yeah.
been so amazing and insightful and open and honest. And I mean, it's exactly what we were hoping that you would share. So we really appreciate it. Yeah, anything else you want to add before we close this out?
I mean, I think the only like last bit is just I think there's always going to be stigma around like sex and what that means. And I always think of that like I always go back to like, especially with movies and things where it talks about like people's like quote, like their numbers, the quote body count and like what those are. And like the more, the less value you have as a person, the higher that number is. And like, as somebody who that number is in the 3 digits, like I still have plenty of value. I still have plenty of worth in this world.
Absolutely.
Like, and all of that experience has brought me some wonderful tidbits that I could share on a podcast today. But I think remembering that, because I think we still very, very, very much live in a culture that will demonize and belittle and try and demean people who are enjoying their bodies and their own autonomy and their own ability to do things that they want to do that make them feel good. And my general philosophy is always like, if you are not bringing harm to other people and you are enjoying yourself, the world is literally on fire. Enjoy yours. Like, do the thing that brings you some joy in a world that is actively trying to remove that joy from your life.
What a great message.
Yeah, I love it.
Message of like, go out there and have sex, everybody.
But really though,
But really,
the world actually is on fire. You might as well fuck
Yeah.
in its way. And
it's like those videos of like, this shows like a meteor hitting the earth and it's like, these are the last minutes on earth. Like, what are you doing? And you're like, I don't know, that guy. Like,
yeah, well, thank you so much again for coming on, and for
Yeah.
our listeners, we will have Eric's information, socials, and also how to find his podcast and follow and listen to him as well. And again, we are Sex Positivity Unfiltered, and remember to stay curious and fuck politeness.